Ja, men då kör vi igång tycker jag. Då kör vi igång. Kör igång nu.
Okay, I think we need to get going. First I would like to say, you have the mic. Welcome everybody. Is this on? Okay. To this year's third Mistra-SWECIA Science Seminar. We actually wrote the second one first, but then we were informed by our program secretary that it's actually the third one. There was a recent one last week, a week and a half ago. This is the first one of the year at SCI. As you know, maybe we're taking turns. We are all program partners are hosting at least once a year this Mistra-SWECIA Science Seminar. This is the fifth one at SCI altogether since the beginning in 2008. And the topic today is the challenge of governing climate change adaptation. I'm just going to say very few words about the filming. As you notice, we have a person here from Stockholm University recording today. It's not live, but we're going to post it on the SCI website as well as on the Mistra-SWECIA website. So I mean, it would be nice if you share the word with others who are interested in the field, that it will actually be available quite soon on these two websites. So, and now I would like to give the floor to the moderator of this day, these sessions today. It's our Center Director of SCI, Johan Kyllenstierna. Welcome. Please that you can join us. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Yes, and just to fill up then, don't walk away with the microphone, because this microphone, then you won't hear anything from the microphone. It doesn't help you. It only helps to the filming. So those that speak need to still speak quite loudly so we can hear in this room. So welcome to this seminar and welcome here to the SCI premises, those that do not normally sit here every day. It's going to be a very interesting seminar, and just to briefly look at the agenda, there are some small changes. One change is that Åsa Persson is not here, unfortunately, to deliver her speech. She had to cancel this morning, which means that there are more room for discussions and debates, and that will, of course, put even more challenge on the speakers. But it means also that we have a little bit more air in the program. But please be very active at the discussions. So that's one change in the program. The plan is, of course, to end at 3 o'clock, or lunch will be organized here in the house. Hopefully a good opportunity to maybe go out and enjoy the weather a little bit outside as well during lunch. And there is also no coffee breaks, if I can see. That was a coffee break beforehand. That's taken out as well. That was a very dramatic shift in the program, I would say. But anyway, I hope we're going to have a very nice day here, focusing on a challenge of governing climate change adaptation, which is, of course, a very, very, very interesting issue, not least considering the financial flows going into this area today. I think one interesting aspect of governance, which may not or may come up today, is, of course, also, I mean, you could say a detail of this is, of course, corruption issues as well. One interesting aspect of this is that Transparency International, was it 2010 or 2011 report? I think it's 2000 combined. The last annual report of Transparency International are looking at corruption, in particular linked to climate change adaptation. So it's definitely an area which will receive a lot of attention, and governance will be key at all levels, both from the global level all the way down to the local level, clearly. So we have a number of very interesting speakers today that will provide different aspects of this, and I would like to introduce the first speaker, Jouni Pavola, there, up there in the back, from Professor School of Earth and Environment at the University of Leeds, and you will speak about social justice and adaptation to climate change. So please, if you can take the floor here, and I will put on, or you can put on this microphone. Yeah. Den här verkar. Ah, there's a green.
Yes.
Can you put it in the pocket?
Yeah, put it in the pocket.
Okay.
Just put it like this.
Okay.
Nej, det går inte den där klippet.
Oj då.
Technical equipment.
Something has happened.
Här. Med här.
Okay.
Oh,
Yes, yeah.
okay.
If it's all right, can you hear me now? Do you think that the voice is all right on that end?
It's all on the desktop already. Wait.
Okay. Well, I'll just.
It's here.
I know. I'll just put the remote in.
Ah, okay.
Okay.
There you go.
Right, and,
It's probably.
oh yeah, it was there. Okay. Good. At the lowest one, the third one.
This one?
Okay, can you please
Okay.
swap
Okay.
this one? Quality.
Right. Hopefully we are getting a better result with this microphone. As I was introduced, I'm a professor of environmental social science at the University of Leeds. I have been working on climate change adaptation related topics for the past 6-7 years. I also lead the climate change governance work program of the Centre for Climate Change Economics and Policy, which is a joint research centre of London School of Economics and University of Leeds. What I hope to do today is to kind of reason out why adaptation is an important topic for study and then why social justice considerations are an important part of the adaptation research agenda. I'll try to tie my discussion to empirical context, and I'm doing so by looking at kind of, like a desk exercise of what ought to be the adaptation priorities in a country like Tanzania if it wanted to do adaptation in a socially just and fair way. And I will conclude by trying to set some of my conclusions and judgments to slightly wider context by comparing what we have done in some other projects as well. So, I oftentimes feel that I have to kind of provide justification for why adaptation is an important issue to study, and that is partly because when I started working on adaptation, it was still a somewhat contentious issue in climate change scholarship. In latter 1990s, early 2000, it was oftentimes seen that recognizing that adaptation is possible or that it would merit attention would somehow undermine pressure from mitigation and the kind of importance of mitigation efforts. I don't think that is so, because we have effectively already committed the next generations to adapt to climate change, no matter how successful we would be in mitigation efforts. So even if we would be able to realize that the most optimistic of greenhouse gas emission reduction scenarios, there would be significant climate change in the cards for the next decades, if not hundreds of years. And even in the more extreme circumstances where we might maintain the current composition of atmospheric chemistry, or actually would be able to discontinue the emissions of greenhouse gases completely, we would still face significant climate change in the coming decades, and then there would be corresponding necessity for many of us to adapt to climate change. And this is also an issue of social justice, because it is not really just to ask us to be quiet about adaptation when some people will need to adapt, no matter whether they contributed to climate change or not. Now, what adaptation is then? My convoluted answer would be that adaptation could be seen as a set of those actions that are taken to avoid or to recover or benefit from the impacts of climate change. Adaptation could be understood as sets of collective and private or individual actions and decisions that are taken at local, national, international, or multiple levels. We can adapt proactively or retrospectively. And the pragmatic set of activities that adaptation could consist of include, for example, public policies, such as those related to disaster risk management or mitigation. It could also include public and private burden sharing arrangements, like provision of insurance and so on. Provision of public goods and services is going to be an important part of adaptation as well. An example of that would be provision of seasonal weather forecasting or climate hazard kind of alerts. We can also do all kinds of investments, both public and private, to fostering adaptation. These might include public investments in flood protection or private investments in weatherproofing buildings. Finally, there is a significant scope for behavioral changes in order to adapt to climate change. These might involve migrating away from most impacted areas, or this might involve also changing livelihood, changing kind of behavioral patterns so as to either avoid adverse climate change impacts or to benefit from the positive ones. Now, in reality, the set of adaptive measures that are undertaken in any one setting will be quite multifaceted. But one thing is sure, that a set of activities is not going to climate-proof the actors. So some residual climate impacts are always going to prevail. And in this slide, we could argue, tentatively speaking, that social justice in adaptation to climate change must have something to do with the incidence of those residual impacts, but it also has to do with the distribution of costs and benefits from actually taking various kinds of adaptive measures. So what then do I mean by social justice in the context of adaptation? Now, an important aspect of social justice in adaptation context is going to be distributive justice. And by that I mean, broadly speaking, the incidence of beneficial and adverse consequences of climate change or actions related to it. There are a variety of takes on distributive justice. I'm not going to go into any detail of those here, but you know, and oftentimes mentioned or referred to rules of distributive justice include just desserts, equality, need, maximum, and so on. And in different contexts, fair distribution is argued to be based on one or another one of these. In my earlier work, I have actually been somewhat critical in one type of application of these norms, and that is that if you try to understand distributive problems as a matter of distributing one overarching good or bad fairly among parties, that the problem there is that it is too narrow a framework. This is oftentimes done when you look at utility-based or monetarily based takes on distribution. I think that, especially in the case of adaptation, but in other contexts as well, it would be necessary to look at distribution as a multifaceted phenomenon. So we would really need to look at economic, ecological, health, and other impacts separately, and not to conflate them into one overarching concern of distribution. If I try to exemplify that, I don't think that kind of looking at adverse ecological consequences and trying to compensate them with money, for example, would be a completely acceptable take on addressing distributive justice, because it isn't obvious that compensation would address all of those implications from burdening people with ecological or health burdens. Now, another area of social justice in adaptation to climate change is that of procedural justice. And by that I mean simply the positioning of actors vis-à-vis processes of decision-making, planning, and governance. This is perhaps somewhat more amorphous, less worked out area of social justice, but key elements of procedural justice in adaptation would be recognition. So which parties, which groups, which interests are being recognized in planning, decision-making, and governance processes. One step further, which bodies can in fact participate and influence decisions, plans, and governance in this setting. And in a sense, as an outcome of that, what is the distribution of power or authority in decisions, plans, planning, and governance in the area of adaptation. Now, if we look at social justice scholarship, distributive and procedural justice clearly are kind of demarcated. There are different communities looking at these issues, and there isn't huge overlap or sharing of agendas happening. But these things are intertwined in practice. All of us would have easy examples of how distribution of income and wealth will influence the actor's ability to participate in planning and decision-making processes, for example. And the other way around, voice or participation in decision-making processes ought to have an impact on the content and distributive outcomes of those proposals, otherwise participation wouldn't have any meaning. There are a few implications from that interlinking of procedural and distributive justice. One of them is that if we want to alter distributive or procedural outcomes, we may need broad-based reforms. If we want to alter distribution of goods and bads, those are partly anchored in the ability of actors to participate, and those distributive changes may require procedural changes as well, and the other way around, obviously, as well. Now, I acknowledge that this slide may not be, easy to see from behind, but I tried jotting down in a kind of form of checklist what would be the sort of important social justice sort of concerns that we ought to check or go through if we are interested in social justice and adaptation. I'll try going through these briefly. Now, the first item in my agenda would be that what is the incidence of climate change impacts in the setting of interest, and how does that incidence of impacts demarcate differently affected groups? Secondly, I would need to know the background inequalities that pertain in that area and shape the vulnerability of those groups, which is likely to be differentiated again. Now, once we understand the incidence of impacts and the background inequalities and start developing some sort of adaptive strategies or plans, then the question is that, okay, what sort of processes are we using? Who do these processes recognize and involve, and to what degree? How is authority in those processes generated, and to whom? Once we have plans and strategies and start implementing those, they will generate a set of benefits which will be, again, distributed differentially within and across groups, and we have to understand that. That there's the same sort of phenomenon happening with the burdens and costs of adaptive measures and strategies, and again, we would need to kind of understand how those burdens and costs are distributed within and across differently impacted groups. And now we are, I think, already quite far down the line. But an important issue then is that we have to understand how the background inequalities, climate change impacts and adaptive measures and strategies create distributions, and what can we say about our adaptive strategies and plans? Do they alleviate background inequalities and unequal incidence of climate change impacts, or are they aggravating it? One could say that a socially just adaptation policy or strategy is doing at least something to alleviate, background inequalities or unequal incidence of climate change impacts. And perhaps as a final issue, I would raise then the point that to what extent do these groups which are disadvantaged or neglected by climate change or adaptation strategies and plans have redress to having their concerns heard and reviewed, and do they get any assistance for doing so? Now, when I'm going to the Tanzanian case study, I will mostly be talking about the early stages of this sort of checklist. We were primarily interested in sort of understanding the background inequalities and incidence of climate change impacts and what those would imply for setting of substantive priorities. I am involved at the moment in a few other projects in which we are kind of going far further into that list. I'll mention briefly one of those in the end of the talk. Okay, so to the case study or exemplification of some of these ideas. So my interest was to ask what should be the adaptation priorities in Tanzania if adaptation there should be socially just. The key starting points in undertaking this work were that I assumed that living with current climate variability will shed some light on living with climate change as well. And I also kind of made the value judgment that vulnerability is and ought to be an important factor when we are setting adaptation priorities, and I'll try backing that claim up shortly in some greater detail. I focused on the region of Morogoro in Tanzania, which is one of the largest regions in the country. It sort of lies between the coastal lowlands and central highlands, has a high proportion of protected areas, isn't particularly disadvantaged or what have you, but in my opinion kind of constituted a good place to conduct the study because there had been a lot of agricultural development studies, related research, and there was a good amount of secondary data available on the region, and there was also a university there, so it was easy place to base your fieldwork on. I should perhaps first clarify my understanding of vulnerability too. If you look at the IPCC documents, they define vulnerability as a function of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, and this is really a relatively sterile notion of vulnerability that arises from the systems thinking that underlies much of IPCC's work. I found the understanding of vulnerability that the natural hazards and disasters literature has far more congenial to what I was doing, and in that literature, vulnerability is understood as characteristics of people and their situation that influence their capacity to anticipate, cope with, resist, and recover from natural hazards. Effectively, vulnerability is a function of factors that demarcate groups that are less able to do these things than others. Now, from that viewpoint, it is clear that climate change will harm vulnerable groups more than others, and that is the reason for understanding the outlines of vulnerability and basing your adaptation planning on vulnerability considerations. Right. Why vulnerability is important? Now, if you look at kind of general experience with climate-related disasters, they do not really affect developed, diverse economies to any significant degree. If you look at 2003 heat wave in Europe, it didn't really leave any trace to the GDP experience of these countries. If you go and look at the asset accounts, there were asset losses that amounted to several percentages of GDP, even here. If you compare the experience after major hurricane or cyclone in a developing country like Honduras, an event like that can wipe out anywhere between 10 and 25% of GDP, of income of such a country. And if you look at the asset side of issues, which is not captured by the income accounts, that the problem there is that most assets in developing countries are not insured. And then those who are typically owned by the kind of large corporations, which oftentimes are owned internationally or what have you. Most of the assets of ordinary actors are uninsured. So when a disaster happens, those assets are lost, unlike the assets in say, Europe, which could be recovered because of the wide existence of insurance. If we look at physical vulnerability, the picture is even more grim. Here I have just two examples from, broadly speaking, the same time. I try to make them as comparable as possible. Hurricane Andrew killed 20-odd people in the United States in 1992, and the year earlier, same category, cyclone killed 130,000 people in Bangladesh. You would get the same sort of comparisons if you looked at earthquakes and things like that. So vulnerability is a significant factor in determining what level of harm will be realized by a given magnitude of negative impact. That's why it ought to be given serious consideration in adaptation planning and setting of priorities. Okay, let's move on to the Tanzanian context then. Tanzania isn't going to be particularly badly hit by climate change in the future. The forecasts are that it would warm by 2 to 4 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. There will be somewhat diversified experience with rainfall. The interior of the country, which is already semi-arid, will get drier, will have up to 20% less rainfall than it has today. In contrast, the Great Lakes region and the coastal strip will get 30 to 50% more water than at the moment. At the same time, the dry seasons will become longer and the rains will come in a concentrated way during the wet season. This will mean that there is going to be both more flooding and more droughts. The water flows will become more seasonal, partly because of this rainfall pattern change, but also because the evaporation will increase because of the higher temperatures. So that will then mean that the possibilities for irrigation will be reduced, the generation of water power will be affected, and communities will have greater difficulties in providing potable water and domestic water in the future. Crop yields will be reduced, in particular because of the warming. The main crop in Tanzania is maize, and it is already at the kind of edge of its kind of comfort zone in Tanzania. So any additional warming will actually quite dramatically reduce the crops, no matter what the availability of water would be. The projections are that the maize yields will decline anywhere between 20 to 70%, which effectively means that you have to abandon the cultivation of maize. There will be also health impacts and land cover changes, but I'm going to skip these largely because that is not very central to what I'm going to try and say in the following. Now, just to kind of try and concretize what climate variability, against climate change is in the country. This is a long-term annual rainfall time series for Morogoro town, which is the regional capital. The key thing to draw from here is that the average rainfall is sort of near 850 millimeters per year, and you can see that in dry years, which are quite frequent, rainfall can drop by a third to about 600 milliliters per year. And in really wet years, the rainfall figures are 50% higher than in the kind of long-term average. You could argue that every fourth year, roughly speaking, is a drought year. That the flooding years may be slightly less frequent, but this is seriously variable climate in terms of rainfall and droughts. There doesn't seem to be any trend in this picture, but I did play a little bit with the figures, and what looks like happening is that there has been kind of 50, 60-year decline in rainfall. I don't think that this is to do with climate change as such. There is some evidence that the water levels in Great Lakes in Tanzania have varied a lot, and that there is a kind of regional longer-term climatic cycle which may be behind this, but it can also be climate change induced change, of course. Well, here is just a monthly range of rainfall over the long term. What you can see is that the main rains during which planting would be done are from February till April, and you can see that in dry years there has been hardly any rain whatsoever in the main growing season, and in wet years there has been 3 or 4 times more than in dry years, and then about twice as much as in a normal year. The problem there is that if you have dry year, your crops don't grow, and if you have wet year, your seeds will be washed away. So disaster both ends. So what do people do to make a living in a setting like that? Morogoro is a relatively agrarian region. There are handful of larger urban settlements, but even those are quite small. Morogoro town, the district capital, has about 250,000 inhabitants, so it's not large by any standards. The livelihood structure is such that most people have many livelihoods. About half of the income, regionally speaking, is generated from agriculture, and that agricultural production is primarily produced for own consumption. You could put a ballpark figure of 2/3 of the output is for own consumption, and the remaining third is then sold for kind of small cash income, so that you can buy school uniforms and things like that for the kids. Now, the key crops in the regions are maize, rice, sorghum, and cassava, and these are typically the ones that are grown for own consumption. Most families do have small livestock, goats, chicken. There are some people who have cattle as well. Those tend to be either wealthier households who have small number of cattle, or else you have some Maasai communities as well who would rely on cattle, livestock primarily as their livelihood. Now, for the other half of the income, it's small business, wage employment, and gathering that are the important factors. And the ordering was, slightly unfortunate, because tapping natural resource base is very, very important. I'll get back to that shortly. The wage employment is oftentimes quite more mundane. It might mean working on somebody else's farm in return for small cash payment, rather than being permanent, significant proportion of full-time type of employment. There is clear difference between income levels of rural and urban dwellers. And I think the reason has to do with the ability to diversify your livelihood. So if you live in urban or peri-urban area, you have access to far more income-earning activities, and you can earn a bigger income, about 3 times as much as you can in deep countryside. And there are certain groups of people who have constraints in accessing diverse livelihoods, and these would include female-headed households, and then pastoralists, and rural dwellers overall, because the market access is a problem for diversification there. Now, if we then look what people have done to try and deal with climate variability, some of those things kind of were already covered, what I said, but these sort of responses to deal with climate variability really fall across all kinds of livelihood strategies. So extensification, using more land, has been the traditional way of dealing with climate variability. An important way of doing that has been simply to clear forest, move cultivations and what have you, but that has reached its limits in the region. There is hardly any forest left to convert into agricultural land outside forest reserves or protected areas. The remaining alternative for most farmers is that they don't rotate their cultivations. They kind of keep them under cultivation for more of the time, which of course then leads to soil erosion and loss of soil fertility. Intensification could be a way out of that, but most of us would know that it hasn't worked particularly well in Africa in general. In this region, that will be the overall conclusion as well, but there are instances where a sort of low-spec intensification has actually worked, and it is mostly to do with vegetable growing for markets in Dar es Salaam, and what some of the scholars have termed kind of low-input fast crops. Tomatoes and onions are an example. You can crop them 6 times a year, and they don't require intensive investment for you to engage in that sort of activity. The most important category of responses is diversification, and I kind of already gave some evidence of that. What you can tell is that there is relatively little cultivation going on after the short rains, which happen in the autumn, because those rains are so risky. The region is sort of between unimodal and bimodal rainfall areas, and you do have occasionally the early rains, but they are not reliable enough for you to grow crops on that basis. So non-farming sources are relied on for income, and those kind of overall terms contribute about 50% of the income. Charcoal production, timber production, and brick production are probably, monetarily speaking, the biggest income earners for households, and these are oftentimes based on a kind of just, obtaining firewood or raw materials from the public domain for publicly accessible forests and kind of converting them into privately saleable goods. But you also have non-timber forest products, medicinal products, poles, construction materials, fodder, honey, which you can, and bushmeat, which you can kind of harvest for market. And there is no kind of universally applicable ballpark how important this is, but most studies have found out that households get somewhere between 20 to 75% of their income from this sort of activities that have to do with the natural resource base around. The people living in deep countryside have the weakest possibility for doing it. The assets there may be better, but the market access is so poor that you have to concentrate on the high-value products like honey or medicinal products. In peri-urban areas, the resources might be more degraded, but the access is far better to the markets and to the resources. Now, what people also do is to change their livelihoods. There is a fairly good evidence to suggest that people are adjusting what they grow, when they grow, and where they grow in light of seasonal weather forecasts or other information that they can gather about the coming season. Now, the final category in my kind of list is migration, and there is a lot of evidence of that too. And it comes in different disguises. I think that there is, at the moment, probably quite significant outflow of people from the deep countryside and even from kind of more urban settlements in kind of rural regions to bigger cities. It's quite difficult to kind of quantify that, and it wasn't my main goal. But if you look at the demographic profiles of rural wards, there is a significant absence of kind of teenager, young adult, both males and females, and that suggests that they probably have left for longer term stay elsewhere. What happens locally is also quite important. You can tell that the people are coming down from upland villages which are remote to lowland valleys because they can gain access to jobs, also better farming opportunities and markets. And this is oftentimes temporary. You might rent out a piece of land and grow crops where they are near the markets. And then there is longer term and a more special type of mobility of people in the pastoralist communities. The long and unusual droughts have led the Maasais to migrate from the north to this region, which has always bordered their kind of foraging territory, but they also have gone through the region much further south to southern Tanzania, which is unprecedented in recent history. So lots of mobility to try and seek opportunities, resources, employment. I mean, it's difficult to quantify that because the data isn't really, that great, and you would need far more investment to do kind of proper study of those things. But I guess it's fair to say that a lot has been done by the locals to try and live with climate variability. And it isn't limited to any one strategy, even though diversification seems to be one important kind of support of that. If I would then look at the key vulnerabilities in this region, as I already stated, lack of access to resources, jobs, markets and services is a real issue. I would say that it clearly is one important factor in determining who is vulnerable and who is not. And those groups would be rural people in general, but women, children and pastoralists in particular. The other important factor to note is that coping with climate variability in the past has caused some worrying consequences which may have serious implications for climate change adaptation in the future. Because of high dependence of households on kind of forest or natural resource-based income, they will kind of need that insurance when things get tough. And yet you can see that the past reliance on natural resource base has sort of already led to undesirable consequences such as deforestation, soil erosion, and changes in hydrological cycles, which kind of make water resources more seasonal. And there is a real danger that these safety nets will not be available in the future. So when climate variability intensifies, the ability to kind of smooth your consumption over time may not be there. I would say that to kind of address this dual issue of access to opportunities and maintenance of safety nets does require collective action. It is not something that can be overcome by individual decisions of households. Our conclusions for this study were that we really need a tripartite strategy for socially just adaptation. The first leg of that strategy would be that we have to find a way of maintaining the safety nets through effective environmental governance, so that those who are in the weakest position can resort to these safety nets when things get difficult. We also have to expand the opportunities so that people can do more to help themselves and then move away from the most climate sensitive activities. And this requires both institutional reforms and infrastructure investments to enable market access. And we didn't have access to international kind of commodity markets or supply chains in our mind as the primary issue here, but it is really to try and foster the functioning of local and domestic markets so that people can kind of put their factors of production to more full use. Now, market participation will also require human capital for it to be rewarding to people, and that is why you have to continue to put emphasis on kind of social welfare provision of health, education, and so on, so that the people can be rewarded for what they do in the markets. I guess this sort of amounts to one answer whether adaptation and development are one or the same thing. I would argue that they are not the same thing if development is understood narrowly as merely kind of income level improvement. But if we understand development as sustainable development, which has environmental, social and economic components, then I would argue that it is quite well in line with what I would understood as socially just adaptation to climate change, at least in the Tanzanian context. Just to kind of finish off, we have worked in some other projects as well, and one project which is now practically concluded, but we are still waiting to publish the results, suggests that in Malawi, curiously enough, it looks like it's the middle income rural households that might be the most vulnerable, and our reasoning has been that the middle income households are not wealthy enough to really diversify their livelihoods away from climate sensitive activities, unlike the rich households. Now, at the same time, they don't have access to burden sharing through social networks to the same extent as the poorer households can. So it leaves them in a more fragile situation, and that sort of study focused on food security in particular, so we don't yet know whether this is something that is specifically relevant for food security or whether it is kind of applicable to more widely to adaptation-related activities. Another study that I'm involving at the moment looks at social justice in the adaptation plans and strategies of UK local authorities. This is a study that includes both a survey element and then an in-depth set of case studies. We have just gone through the survey stage, and the worrying picture that emerges from that survey is that adaptation planning is not widespread at all in the UK, despite the fact that UK is hit quite hard by flooding, health-related, climate change impacts and so on. And part of the reason is that it remains voluntary, and the new government has made it clear that it considers adaptation planning as a local activity and not something that will be led by the central government. There is some sectoral planning going on, of course, through the government agencies, but the kind of comprehensive adaptation planning is really a local thing. And in the local authorities that have done adaptation planning and strategy development, the divergence of practices is huge. There are some which have done exemplary adaptation plans and strategies, and there are others who merely have some principles laid out. Thus, we are not expecting that we will have strong findings regarding the robustness of social justice considerations in adaptation plans. But when we do choose the best cases, the most robust cases, what we will be doing is to look at flooding, health, and heat as the kind of key climate change impacts, and we'll try to see to what extent the background inequalities, vulnerabilities, and kind of distribution burdens and benefits of adaptation are actually considered in those plans. Thank you. I will leave it to that.
Thank you very much. Maybe you can keep it on for a while. It's nice to take a few questions directly after. Okay. And we have quite a lot of discussion time in the end, but that's more general also, maybe following both presentations, and there might be some specific ones. It was very interesting, your presentation, not least these final points about the UK as well, to see that, we have a tendency to focus, of course, on developing countries and all the problems they have. But obviously it's an area, at least if you look at the UK, where you have a lot of problems also in developed countries when it comes to adaptation plans and having clear strategies and resources for that, obviously, as well. So there are many interesting questions, I think. But I would like to ask the colleagues first here if there are direct clarification questions. I'm sure there must be. Some, at least. Otherwise, maybe... Yes, please, Oscar. Sorry, hang on here.
Well, climate change is something that happens far into the future. You mentioned the situation in the year 2100. Many other drivers will have had their impact or effect at that time. Could you say something about how, is climate change relevant
So just to repeat the question a little bit, so it's a little bit about contextualization. I mean,
Yeah.
is climate change the main driver, and how is that interrelated to many other drivers that are already ongoing, and like population growth, economic development, etc., and in the longer term in particular?
Yeah. I think that your point is well taken. The kind of time factors are important. If I would have worked on a kind of more substantial evidence generating base rather than on kind of trying to exemplify social justice issues and their implications for adaptation planning, I think the burden of proof would have been even bigger. I think climate change is already having an impact on these communities. It's quite difficult to discern it, and I think placing the burden of proof on us is somewhat unfair, because climate change primarily happens through increased climate variability, both intensification of extremes and you know, frequency changes. So where do you draw the baseline? What is climate change and what is climate variability? I don't think that it's actually that important to try and nail it down, because what you would want to do is to make sure that when you make decisions and investments that are dictated by other concerns, population growth, economic growth, you know, poverty, what have you, that you do those, you know, decisions so that you are not maladapting if you can avoid it. So you would want to make decisions so that you realize the synergies between, you know, some other concerns and climate change adaptation concerns in the best possible way.
But is that what, I mean, what you're talking about is mainstreaming climate change as an aspect into all other kind of planning, but yeah, hasn't that partly been one of the challenges to make sure that this happens, and then that's why we have sort of quite a lot of specific focus on climate change adaptation today? Because it doesn't really happen.
Yes. Now, I take again what you kind of say. I think that the difficulty there is that good amount of both mitigation and adaptation will need to be delivered locally. I mean, on the mitigation side at the moment, we are primarily dealing with large sectoral type of activities, you know, that kind of give us the you know, good proportion of the volume with relatively low transaction costs. Now, when we move further into mitigation, then we are coming to factors like transport and housing and things like that, which you know, kind of require delivery at the site. So, you know, it's the local governments who will make decisions about transport within the broader kind of policy setting. When they do decisions about mitigation and transport, they also kind of make commitments that are relevant for adaptation. So many things do get together at the local level, and I think that adaptation and mitigation are jointly delivered in that area. It doesn't mean that it would be bad to keep on talking about the importance of adaptation and social justice in it, because you still need to kind of raise those points. The you know, mainstreamed and integrated delivery always risks kind of losing sight of some important considerations. So on one hand, that might be the pragmatic delivery mechanism, but it doesn't mean that you know, everything is fine when you have actually, you know, obtained that sort of delivery. You need to keep on bashing on the important considerations.
Okay. Yes, we have an additional question here from Marcus, please. Maybe you can say also briefly who you are, actually. Sorry, I should have asked you to do the same.
Marcus Carson, Stockholm Environment Institute, sociologist. I guess my question is whether you've noticed in your work around adaptation, if that either in the UK or Tanzania has increased the sense of urgency around the mitigation side. You mentioned that those things link up. I wonder if you see that sort of a reinforcing effect.
Perhaps no. I sort of think that I know what you are kind of asking the question for. But my anecdotal evidence is that it might rather be in the kind of middle income kind of emerging polluter economies which are, still relatively sensitive to climate change impacts, but where mitigation isn't yet on the agenda, where this might, it's primarily based on anecdotal discussions with my, Spanish, Mexican colleagues and what have you. I see the coupling more strongly there because I think that they are in both camps, more prominently than the least developed countries on the one hand, or the developed economies on the other hand.
One question also that I don't know, maybe partly a little bit, but what you talked about a lot is, of course, the local level, what the people are doing at the local level to adapt to climate variability, I would guess, in most cases. But that the question there, top-down or bottom-up approaches, climate change quite often when we talk about it still, we look at projections, we talk about 2030, 2050, 2100. From your experiences working in Tanzania and Malawi and so on, how much are people at the local level really thinking in those time spans? Aren't they just adapting basically on a very, very short term, short-sightedness term, because they live from one day to the next, more or less? And most of what we're talking about here then becomes quite a lot of top-down necessity, meaning that the government should sort of support long-term planning.
I think that your point about the short term in developing countries is valid, but I would also kind of ask to what extent the long term really prevails in countries like Sweden or United Kingdom or European Union. There is some talk about that, but if you look at the actions on the ground, I'm not convinced that the long term is receiving much more emphasis in here either. And certainly, your point about adaptation in Europe and in developing countries, I think there are interesting elements there. I would say that the developing world is ahead clearly with the adaptation agenda when it comes to actually planning, prioritizing and developing measures compared to say, most European countries. Concrete things are being planned. The awareness is much bigger. I think that in Europe we have a long way to go before we have mustered the same level of awareness and action on adaptation side. Yet there are actually a lot of things that have very concrete implications for ordinary people. I mean, I don't know how it is in Sweden, but when I go back home to Finland in the summer, when I was a child, we could, roam around in the forest, no problem, come home and have dinner, what have you. Now, if I go there with my kids, I have to inspect them for ticks and kind of make sure that they haven't been bitten and take them to the hospital if I have any suspicions that they might have been exposed to tick bites. You can see that the health impacts because of introduction of exotic, disease vectors is already, an issue in Nordic region, and it will become more so. And the drought, flooding cycles are going to be, causing problems as well because of the thin soils and relatively limited amount of kind of groundwater that is present in most localities. I mean, the large amount of surface water does help, but it doesn't leave, people unexposed to variations in that sort of things.
But do you think at the local level, will people more adapt still gradually, or will they actually? I mean, what is actually driving change? Is it just a gradual adaptation to what is happening from one year to the next, or is it us in Europe or in Africa looking at 2030, there will likely be more floods and droughts?
Well, I mean, there is what will happen and what should happen. Those are kind of two questions. I think that there will be a degree of adaptation because it will always be beneficial, advantageous for individuals or local communities to undertake adaptation. Now, whether that is the optimal amount of adaptation, I don't think so. So that the collective, top-down guidance and direction is quite important. Whether you can, generate a political will to do that is another thing. But without that direction, the amount of adaptation that will happen will be smaller, and whether it will have long enough time frame, I think it is a good question. But adaptation will be more complex, more messier area, and more difficult from the viewpoint of governance, which is the topic of today's seminar, than mitigation in some respects, because of that, complexity on the ground among the actors that are impacted and might need to adapt.
Hi, hi, I'm Peter Rudberg, research associate at SCI. And I was wondering, you're talking about the governance being messier and so on, and then when you have this list of what to look at, when you look at adaptation and social justice, and it looks like you need almost perfect foresight, and it's very, very, and in real life we know it's, as you said, it's much more messier. So how do you deal with that, or do you have any suggestions? Because we can make very good lists, but then in real life it's very hard often to follow them.
Let me first say that I don't think that there's a magic institutional bullet. There is no one governance solution that will do it all for you. I think there are drivers that will lead to generation of bottom-up initiatives, just like there are in mitigation side. And I think that is good. It is unlikely to be sufficient. Now, how do you then instigate more? You do require some kind of bottom-up, or some kind of top-down, strategy to try and incentivize and mandate more activity. Then how do these voluntary bottom-up and mandatory top-down strategies interact? That's actually a research project I'm hoping to start, next year. But I think that there are some practical solutions that would be beneficial. What we have already seen and what we have discussed in European Environmental Agency is that there are no mechanisms for learning, from local context to another one. So thinking about kind of best practice and lesson transfer mechanisms, that is very, very important. And, this is important because on one hand, you have to raise awareness of the benefits and demand for adaptive measures and planning on one hand. But on the other hand, you have to kind of be able to provide to those who need to do the adaptation planning some understanding of cost and consequences, so that not too much risk is attributed to solutions which are actually relatively easy and simple to adopt. Funding is another important factor. If there is no funding and everything has to be coughed up by the actors themselves, it is going to be a serious constraint. So you have to actually think the adaptation funding framework, both within countries, when you're talking about countries like Sweden or UK, but also kind of international when you're talking about adaptation funding for sub-Saharan Africa or other exposed regions. And the amount of adaptation that will happen, the type of adaptation that will happen, is going to be seriously influenced by the level of funding that is available. I mean, if you look at the international estimates of adaptation costs and funding needs, I remember that when I worked with Neil Adger on this project, from which my case study kind of comes from, we estimated that adaptation and kind of climate change impacts compensation would probably be around 60 billion US dollars per year when we are talking about developing countries only. And the latest IIED review suggested that globally speaking we might be talking about 100-200 billion US dollars per annum sort of figures, and that's 2 to 4 times global current overseas development assistance. So we are talking about seriously big amount of money, and you need to have something like carbon tax or which is globally applied to raise that sort of revenue.
Okay, so maybe that's an add-on funding compared to all other funds that already are invested, of course. So maybe a last question before we take the next presentation, please.
Thank you. Gregor Tools from Umeå University and in short at the SCI. I would like to come back to your, you've given a definition of vulnerability as the function, no, sorry, as the characteristics of people to anticipate and cope with stresses. I would like to ask you about the context you've been studying in Tanzania, because we've just seen some ethnical violence in neighboring Kenya, and you've been talking that some of the Maasai are actually moving south into areas that haven't been settled on before. Do you see any of those kind of conflicts?
Yes. Tanzania, I think, has had more sort of unitary outlook in the past, because it's kind of, in terms of religion, ethnicity, and you know, kind of tribal orientation, about as diverse as any other Eastern African country is. You could tell that the Rwanda genocide and the resulting influx of refugees from Rwanda clearly did not go down well, and there have been conflicts between the you know, migrants and or kind of people who are in exile and the locals. There is recurrent violence between the pastoralists and farmers in those communities where they kind of both are using the same landscape. In 1990s, I think that there were skirmishes where dozens of people were killed. At the moment, I don't really know the extent of those. It depends on build-up of kind of constraints for you know, livestock maintenance and so on. But what has happened now is that the Maasais have relocated to southern Tanzania, which is quite unusual. So they are effectively keeping their cattle in Selous game reserve, which is very sparsely populated. So the cattle to human conflict may be reduced, but it doesn't mean that it's unproblematic for many other reasons. I can tell that the religious confrontation and tensions have increased, particularly among the Muslim and Christian communities. So I guess an important question, which again, I mean, actually is part of adaptive capacity, really, when you think about, you know, that as a kind of domestic political, you know, challenge, having the social capital to actually work together across those divides, you know, can erode, and to an extent has eroded, and Tanzania probably had more of that than the neighboring countries. Now, whether, you know, damage can be repaired and things will, you know, move forward smoothly, I don't know. I'm not discouraged, but I can see that you know, from mid-1980s when I first worked in Tanzania, the divisions are more visible and perhaps more conflictual than they were at that time. And you know, it remains to be seen how things develop in the next 10, 40 years.
Okay, thank you very much. So again, a very important contextualization, of course, of the problem. So thank you. So while we are getting the next speaker up, maybe since you're not going to get any coffee, that was terrible, the reduction of the coffee. Since you're not going to get any coffee, all others stand up a little bit and shake a little bit so you keep your energy level high. So let's get the next speaker on board.
Anybody's kind of up, you know, forward and backward, and there's a you know, point in the middle.
Which one is yours? Which one is yours? It's triple. No.
Gud, high-tech. Hallå Marcus!
Okay, thanks a lot. I hope you feel reinvigorated and energetic now. So I would like to welcome Mr. Johannes Strippel, Assistant Professor at the Department of Political Science at Lund University. with a presentation on justice and legitimacy in allocating adaptation resources. So please, you have 45 minutes also for your presentation.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me. I've been working together with a couple of you here. I was looking around to see if I'm sure I've met a bunch of you here at the conferences. I was in the same research project as Richard and Åsa, called Adam, a few years ago, and I've been working with Måns Nilsson on scenario analysis. But I've never been here physically at SCI. Meet you in the US or wherever. So it's really good to be here. I'm going to do a presentation today which is a little bit more principle, theoretically grounded than Juni's. I think we'll complement each other quite well on this. I'm familiar with one of your backgrounds here. I suppose that few of you have done sort of the political theory that is somewhere in behind of this presentation. So please ask questions if you... I'll try to go through it slowly and so you can see what kind of flavor for this kind of reasoning. The research that I'm going to present, or the thoughts, comes from a research project that is ongoing together. The research project is called Fair and Feasible Climate Change Adaptation. And it's me and Göran Dus Utterström. He is at the University of Gothenburg. And it's Sverker Jagers, who is in Gothenburg and up in Luleå. And it's a project that is funded by the Swedish Research Council and also by Formas. We've been having the grant for around 1.5 years or so, and we still have, I think, two more years to go or so. So we're starting. We've done some research. There's some papers and publications coming out. The overall question in the project is about what is a fair politics of adaptation. So we asked, one question that we ask is, who should pay for adaptation? What are the criteria that we should use when we determine who should pay? And how much they should pay, based on what principles, and how should the resources be allocated. And I will today talk about that second question. We also been writing a little bit on the kind of institutional arrangements that could bring about fair adaptation. We've been focusing a little bit on insurance. There's a paper coming out on why insurance is a really bad idea from justice perspective. And also we're doing some research on the NAPAs and the Green Climate Fund. I also thought that also was going this afternoon to speak more about that, so I left that out of my presentation, but in the question we could maybe talk a little bit about that. So, justice and legitimacy. Climate change adaptation, the proactive or reactive measures that enables persons, communities or nations to cope with the adverse effects of a changing climate, raises two broad questions. First, how to get the resources into the systems. Second, how to dish them out. How shall we allocate these resources among recipients? Both questions raise profound questions of distributive justice, for we ideally want the costs and benefits of adaptations are shared in a fair way. The question of what principle or set of principles that should guide the financing of adaptation is a question of fair burden sharing. The question of what principle or set of principles that ought to guide the allocation of adaptation resources is a question of fair benefit distribution. So we can talk about the fair burden sharing and the question of fair benefit distribution, how to get the money in and how to dish them out. And the justice is relevant to both of those questions. While it is natural to think about these questions as sequentially ordered and independent of each other, first we get the resources in and then we dish them out. In reality, the questions should not be treated separately. We cannot say how big the total adaptive burden is until we know how ambitious the adaptive responses ought to be. Hence, the answer to the benefit distribution question will influence the answer to the burden sharing question. We know that patterns of adaptation funding are often specified prior to a decision on what the funding is supposed to achieve. Think about the 100 million per year by 2020 that Hillary Clinton just announced when she came to Copenhagen. That was not based on any sort of assessment of what the needs are. It was just came out, and then we're questioning, okay, so how should we get that? But if the pattern of burden sharing depends on the size of the burden, this is, however, the wrong way of going about it. We need to have an account of the benefit distribution before we can specify who pays into adaptation schemes. However, the benefit distribution question not only raises questions about distributive justice. Junior has noted in a paper a few years ago on the ethics of adaptation that this concerns really about how the resources are received. It is one thing to identify the principles that ought to guide the allocation of adaptation resources. It is another thing whether a recipient of the resources endorses that principle. Thus, adaptation also raises profound questions of legitimacy. With legitimacy, I mean the extent to which the recipient of adaptation resources consents or endorses the way in which the resources are allocated. So we have the questions of justice, and then we have the questions of legitimacy. So those are the two broad themes that I would like to discuss today. Both the justice problem and the legitimacy problem of adaptation allocation need much more elaboration from scholars and practitioners. I think that we have just started to grasp this field ideally, and policy is moving much further than sort of science-based analysis of this is trying to catch up with. Today is not the place for a thorough treatment of justice and legitimacy. Just want to give you a flavor for how one can think of these in these terms and get a flavor for this kind of analysis. And also I'll end with some notes on the current status of international climate policy development and whether justice and legitimacy will be possible to think through in terms of the changing climate policy landscape toward a more fragmented scene. So, allocating adaptation resources. What do we want from the allocation of adaptation funding? First, we want that the benefit distribution ideally should meet the requirements of both justice and legitimacy. The distribution shall be both just and legitimate. We can think of justice as a morally appropriate pattern of distribution of burdens and benefits. Climate justice, on this understanding, concerns the appropriate pattern of distribution of climatic burdens and benefits. In all matters of distribution, it is essential to have a value that guides the distribution of the things we are distributing. Typical of this value is material resources. Political theorists sometimes call this that we must have a currency of justice. Theories of adaptation allocation usually single out the notion of vulnerability as the appropriate currency here. Resources are to be distributed in a way that is guided by the vulnerability of various agents to climate change. So, suppose then that we accept vulnerability as the appropriate currency. How should adaptation resources be allocated? What kind of principles can we use here? And I will run through 4 principles called equality, leximin, utility, and priority to get a feeling for, depending on the principle that we choose, we will get very different kinds of distributions that are just according to the principle that we choose. So, if we follow the equality principle, then adaptation resources should be allocated so as to approximate that all relevant agents are equally invulnerable to climate change. So the idea with equality is that we should put everybody on the same level of vulnerability. In general, we think that equality is a very sort of nice principle. It's attractive in that it coheres with the view that persons are of equal moral worth. But it do suffer from some flaws. First of all, someone might question the principle on grounds of feasibility. Given how unequal vulnerabilities to climate change are distributed, in large part due to the dramatic differences in wealth, it simply does not seem possible to achieve equal vulnerability. Junior have in a paper a few years ago put forward and defended a principle called leximin. So the Lexman principle, if we allocate resources following the Lexman principle, it holds that adaptation resources should be allocated so as to make the worst off as well off as the second to worst off. Then, if there remains any resources, as well off as the third off. So you take the lowest bottom and you lift them to the ones who are second, if we have a sliding scale of vulnerability here. The problem, however, with Lexman is that it will be incredibly hard to satisfy. Getting the worst off to or near the level of the second to worst off might require us to spend an enormous amount of resources, and as resources are scarce, this will be inefficient and wasteful. In political theory, the question of, for example, handicapped people, and if they have the right to, if we should spend all societal resources to get handicapped people to have the same level of quality of life as everybody else, or if we have to accept some struggling with that. So that is a question that is inherent in the Lexman principle. So there is a kind of wastefulness in the Lexman, which stems from its under-appreciation of what we might call the utilitarian component of morality, whether what we do makes people's lives go better overall. The principle of making distribution depending on whether it makes people's lives go better overall is utilitarianism. So we move on to the utility principle. So if you use the utilitarian principle, then adaptation resources should be allocated so as to make the expected consequences as beneficial as possible. Thus, utilitarianism enjoins us to allocate adaptation resources in accordance with standard cost-benefit analysis. Once costs and benefits are suitably understood, we should allocate resources so as to make the overall balance as beneficial as possible, taking all relevant agents into account. The worry with this view, of course, is that it seems too insensitive to differences in vulnerability. It is possible, for example, that we get the best consequences overall by spending most adaptation resources on the US. So take Eunice's example with Hurricane Andrew and the wealthy off ranchers in Florida. You get lots of bang for the buck by making those wealthy people adapt to increase storms and hurricanes. So this does not feel very good, although it is very just from a cost and benefits perspective, utilitarian perspective. It's a wise spending of resources. The Florida case suggests that what we want is a principle that is sensitive to absolute levels of vulnerability, yet contains a utilitarian component. The principle that fits the bills is prioritarianism, so priority. The prioritarian principle will hold that adaptation resources should be allocated so as to make the expected consequences as beneficial as possible, but the moral value of a gain increases the worse off the recipient is. So the idea is that if you might have two agents. Can you see anything with this panel? So if we have two agents and we can increase their quality of life by a factor of 10. So the size of the welfare gain is the same. We should choose the agent which is most worse off. So distributing adaptation resources based on the prioritarian principle mean that improvements in adaptive capacity matter more the more vulnerable the person, community, or nation is. So the prioritarian principle compared to the other one has some advantages, I think, that one could. So in our project, we try and have tried a little bit to defend the prioritarian principle against the other ones. So we think it's a more just way of distributing adaptation resources. The prioritarian principle has the advantage then to respect the claims of the worst off. It gives us what the principle of equality gives us, without suffering from leveling down. The leveling down problem is that, of course, if we have the equality principle, then one idea is to bring the well-off down. That will make it very even. But the prioritarian principle don't have this problem of leveling down. The prioritarian principle also overcomes the notion of wastefulness to some extent. While it matters more to benefit the worst off, if there are really great gains to the well-off and marginal gains to the worst off, then it's more beneficial to help the well-off. So it has this utilitarian concept in it, not to be a wasteful principle. So hopefully that gave you some idea. There are more principles that you could use, sufficient-tarianism, and there are more ideas that you use, how you can think through adaptation in terms of different starting points of just principles of justice. Okay, moving on to legitimacy. Whichever of those principles that we have just discussed wins our favor, it only answers the question about the justice of a pattern of distribution. In order to make the allocation morally right, we also need to think about whether the pattern of distribution is perceived as legitimate. We could argue until our faces are blue and say that the priority principle is the most just way to distribute scarce resources among needy agents. It is still problematic to act on that principle unless it is also endorsed by the recipients of the resources. What do the urban dwellers say about the distribution of resources? Do they have a say here regarding the question that we distribute the resources? So that these things should be endorsed by the recipients. This is so in both a moral sense and in a feasibility sense. We are usually cautious to implement practices that do not inspire widespread consent among the affected. Otherwise, we risk paternalism or domination. Moreover, unless there is such consent, chances are at any rate small that the practice will be effective in achieving what it sets out to do. Hence, legitimacy is as key to the practice of allocating adaptation resources as justice. So I think it's important here to not just talk about justice in isolation, but to bring in legitimacy, and that legitimacy is as important when we think about distributing resources. Legitimacy in political theory and in societal discourses is quite a complicated concept. It is often understood to have both a moral and an empirical part. That is, legitimacy is used to gauge both the objective moral value of an act or practice, as well as its ability to win the subjective consent of the affected agents. For example, think about the slave trade. At its time, it might have enjoyed a widespread consent or endorsement. That is the empirical part of legitimacy. But that did not make it moral permissible, the moral sense of legitimacy. Or conversely, think about vegetarianism. Even if it turns out that the case for vegetarianism is incredibly compelling, the moral sense of legitimacy, that does not mean that the state can force people to stop eating meat in violation of their own deeply held convictions, the empirical sense of legitimacy. So legitimacy is thus often treated as a compound concept comprising both empirical and moral factors. However, what I think is most central is its reference to this empirical consent factors. Whether affected agents approve of an act or a practice, for example, a distribution. So legitimacy is about the rightful authority of various commands and crucially depends on the consent of the affected. Thus, in climate justice, we will regard as legitimate climate actions that inspire the endorsement or at least non-refusal of burdens takers and benefit recipients. Then we can make a distinction between direct consent and indirect consent. Jonah had that up in his presentation when he talked about how do people have a say here. And the distinction between direct and indirect, this is the idea here, that with regard to direct consent is a consent to a command that stems from an affected party agreeing with the substance of the command. Thus, a recipient might agree with the way an adaptation fund allocates adaptation resources in her country. If so, she approves of the outcome on independent ground. This is then direct consent. Indirect consent is a bit more complex, but no less familiar. It obtains when a person agrees with the command because it follows from procedures she consents to. Thus, a recipient might agree with an allocation not because she endorses the pattern of distribution on independent ground, but because she endorses the procedure that gave birth to it. So the procedures for generating this consent is of utmost importance. Okay, so if we combine this and try to think about how we can allocate adaptation resources. So the idea here is that the moral rightness of an allocation depends on both justice and legitimacy, but these can and do conflict. So we think about this 4 different possibilities here then, combining legitimacy and justice. We can begin by excluding from our analysis boxes 1 and 4. Boxes 1 capture distributions that are both just and legitimate. These are trivially morally right to produce, and this is where we ideally want all adaptation policies to fit in. We want it to be just and we want it to be legitimate. Box 4 captures distributions that are neither just or legitimate. So these are, of course, trivially morally wrong. The analytical attention and the difficult cases here are in box 2 and 3. Box 2 captures distributions that are unjust but legitimate. We here find things that are on objective grounds unjust, but which nevertheless win the consent or endorsement of the affected. For example, it might be a country that distributes adaptation resources on the principle of simple utilitarianism, when we think that prioritarianism is a true theory. So, Tanzania might have nice procedures, but they come up with a way of distributing their resources based on utilitarian, so they will sort of then adapt the well-off people and rich people in the city. So if it's legitimate, but from our perspective unjust, how do we deal with that? Will they still have money through the established Green Climate Fund for doing that? The most intriguing situation, I think, is found in box 3, distributions that are just but not legitimate. Here we face a particularly tough analytical problem. Are such acts dismissed outright? If so, we place heavy emphasis on consent or endorsement and treat legitimacy as a necessary condition. Most would rather want to place some, but not all, weight on legitimacy. I'll expand a little bit more on legitimacy here, and then we'll have some cases in box 3. Legitimate but unjust cases. In climate policy, the importance of legitimacy is often stressed. We often hear talk of how to create political procedures that are inclusive and participatory. The idea is that when allocating adaptation resources, local and indigenous people should be consulted, as they have the best knowledge of local circumstances and hence are better equipped to allocate resources in a desirable way. So that is an epistemic argument. Locals knows best. Another reason for going bottom-up has more to do with legitimacy per se, and specifically the moral importance of legitimacy. So when allocating adaptation resources, local and indigenous expertise should have a say, perhaps even a decisive say, as it's up to them as free and equal agents to decide over the manner in which resources are allocated in their group, community, or nation. So if we then believe that legitimacy has a moral importance that is independent from justice, one should subscribe to this principle. Pursuing an allocation of benefit that the recipients do not endorse is, on this view, a kind of moral bad, probably best thought of as an instance of disrespect. The idea here is that adaptation allocation should ideally satisfy requirements of justice and legitimacy. In short, we prefer the box 1 to the one that occupies box 3. However, this claim gives rise to straightforward dilemmas. What if the local agents want to distribute resources in a way that is unjust, according to the conception of justice that we favor? Sometimes, of course, the local agents might be so corrupt, morally vicious, or disordered that we need not pay attention to their own views. It is not obvious, for example, that North Korea should be given the resources to climate-proof their nuclear facilities, should they ask for it. But at other times, the conflict is not that easily overridden. Suppose that prioritarianism is the just principle allocation, but that a recipient wants to allocate adaptation resources according to simply utilitarianism. It is not obvious now that we are right in overruling her view. This is the key problem of legitimacy. To sum up, it will be important here then to have an idea in when we set up the Green Climate Fund or the framework for adaptation, to have an idea where how much emphasis do we put on justice, and what do we do if, even if we think that countries should have a say, or local agents or municipalities, and if they distribute the resources in the way that we think is morally wrong. So let me briefly end up by touch upon the global governance of adaptation and the question of legitimacy here. When looking at the international climate policy development that I'm sure you are very familiar with, in my view, it's helpful to think of two different ways of organizing an international response to climate changes. At one end of the scale, we find a truly international architecture of agreements and commitments that enables a coordinated climate governance, whether related to mitigation or adaptation. At the other end of the scale, we assume that international climate action is dominated by choices made by autonomous state and private actors with little effort to ensure political coordination between states. At this end of the scale, local and national level actions dominate, loosely coupled through ad hoc coalitions, partnerships, sectoral initiatives, and network. So if you take those two extremes and think about the global governance of adaptation, in the case of adaptation being coordinated and negotiated internationally, the recurrent soundtrack is about sharing the burdens of adaptive planning. A global approach to adaptation would be achieved through high levels of international coordination, manifested by an agreement on burden sharing, based on, for example, historical responsibility and capacity to pay. The revenues in such a system will be raised, feed into large-scale international coordinated funds for adaptation, which disperses resources to countries, sectors, and groups. In the opposite case, where adaptation will be much less centrally organized and more evolving in autonomous fashion, the recurrent mantra would be, let them adapt. At this end of the scale, we assume that no broad international agreement on adaptation is in place. In the case that it is possible to speak of adaptation governance, this occurs mainly through small regional agreements, primarily in the developing world. Adaptation is seen primarily as a concern for the market and systems of commercial insurance. In the developing world, some coalitions of the vulnerable push for actions on specific issues, drought and flooding, but their claims do not resonate in wider contexts of justice and responsibility. In my view, I think that the governing climate change after Copenhagen is increasingly characterized by fragmentation. This is particularly evident at the international level, where the Kyoto Protocol-centered regime with its emphasis on targets and timetables and legal binding treaty seems to be replaced with new and multi-centered efforts. So, even if global adaptation governance is only rather nascent, there is already a plethora of institutions, actors, levels, and modes of governance. We have the National Appropriate Plans of Actions, the NAPAs. We have the adaptation framework under the UNFCCC. We have the recently established Green Climate Fund with a transitional committee now up and running to oversee the fund, which will then be handed to the World Bank, and then to a joint board of developing and developed countries. We have all the bilateral deals that are emerging. We have the mainstreaming of climate adaptation. So there is clearly not one single center emerging where adaptation burdens will be negotiated, as I see it. So I think that one argument here is that the more fragmented adaptation governance will be, the more difficult it will be to make sure that decisions are made on grounds of justice and legitimacy. It will be very difficult to work out all the procedures that will be necessary the more fragmented the landscape will be. Procedures of inclusions and the right to have a say. So I think that is where I went. We could talk a little bit more about the specific institutions, but this was sort of the theoretical backgrounds of justice and legitimacy in adaptation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Again, very, very interesting and complex, I must say.
Yeah, sorry.
No, but it's my sort of limitations, rather, probably. I'm just speaking for myself when I talk about complexity here. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of interesting questions as well directly to you, and then maybe when we've taken a number of questions for you, we could maybe go back and have a more general discussion as well with both speakers. You had a question? Yes, please.
I really wanted to kind of follow on from your last slide. I think that I would probably be able to draw a more forceful conclusion from the slide that you ended up doing. If you have a fragmented kind of governance strategy of adaptation, adaptation will basically happen autonomously by those who have the resources and who can benefit from it. And then, you know, the adaptation pattern is primarily kind of, you know, benefit seeking and capacity kind of driven, and it is not driven at all by vulnerability. So you could argue that it will be very difficult to reconcile that sort of outcome with kind of view of you know, socially just adaptation. I don't know what your reaction to that would be.
Yeah.
Any comments?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, the themes that I've been talking about, legitimacy and justice, you see them recurring in the guidelines for the Green Climate Fund and maybe in the conferences that will be organized ahead of Johannesburg. But as you said, the more there will be more bilateral deals, the more there will be on local level, it will be much more difficult to take this on board. And certainly with establishing the procedures that we will think will be enough to say that, well, this has actually been a legitimate procedure, and then we will respect the decision that this country municipality will come to in the way in which they want to distribute the resources. And we know from developmental aid that if we view the more we view climate finance as aid, the more control we want of the rich country want of the resources, and they will not be happy with having the agents to decide for themselves on how to distribute the resources.
My name is Kristina Blano. I'm professor of landscape planning of Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences. So I just have a comment on your comment, actually, about autonomous adaptation. And I assume that you mean that the adaptation that will happened without having any authorities or organized way of implementing it. And you mentioned that you thought that that would then lead to only those being able to take opportunity that would actually adapt. And my experience from working with Swedish landowners is actually the opposite, that it's actually those who are vulnerable that feel that they have the strongest motivation to take measures to adapt, and actually those are the ones that are adapting more than those who have taking opportunity. Thank you.
Thank you. While I walk over to you, Åsa, just a question also when it comes, I mean, my sense was, but maybe I'm wrong here, but my sense was that a coordinated approach, coordinated adaptation is better than autonomous adaptation.
I think it's easy to organize just questions of justice and legitimacy if one would have tried to get the funds together and try to have the...
Because my sort of follow-up question, if you look at ODA, for instance, we tend to set up a lot of criteria and so on. We talked about corruption before, which means that a lot of ODA ends up with 10, 15 countries, and quite often not those countries that are most in need, because they have most problems with governance and so on. Isn't there a major risk there? I don't say that the other one would give them more, but isn't that a significant risk that, again, it continues to focus on very few countries and not necessarily those in most need? Or?
Yeah, thank you. Sure. If we have high criteria for what would count as a legitimate procedures, that could surely lead to exclusion of a lot of countries that are not able to establish those kinds of procedures.
So we have to be careful about that, partly.
Åsa Svartling at the Stockholm Environment Institute. Thanks, Johannes, for a very interesting and enriching discussion on the theoretical contribution to on ethical dimensions of adaptation governance. And you used the case of Tanzania as an example or illustration of how justice and legitimacy play out in practice. But I was also a little curious to hear if you are planning to apply this to empirical context cases somewhere, or do you see this project as a purely theoretical basis?
We have applied the framework to the NAPAs and looked at the NAPAs the idea with the NAPAs was to say that, well, all the countries need to have their own idea about their adaptation priorities, and they will come up with this list of what would they want to prioritize and the procedures for that. What I think the NAPA seems to be a little bit out of fashion now. In the UNFCCC adaptation framework, the NAPAs are hardly not mentioned, and one wants to set up a similar local level-based procedure which should seem to replicate what the NAPAs were doing, but maybe giving them a little bit more weight. So we have applied the framework to the UNFCCC adaptation framework, a little bit to the Green Climate Fund. We talked about climate refugees in this perspective, but we've just started, I think. But I think one could sort of ask the question about every of those institutions that are built. One could ask about it, but we have not done it on a sort of going at a municipal level that UN has done, or looked at that really local level kinds of participatory decision making, whether those are legitimate procedures or so.
Marcus Carson again. Thanks, Johannes, for the presentation, for sort of taking this to a more abstract level. I wonder, have you thought about this in terms of input-output legitimacy? Because in some sense, those pieces seem to be here. That on the one hand, you've got process, on the other hand, you've got result, and those can be very, very much in conflict with one another, right? Sometimes the result is appreciated if the process is right, even if it's not optimal. But have you? I mean, it seems to me to be a fairly easy, intuitive way to distinguish.
Yeah, I usually think of legitimacy and input as my output. It's useful in some sense, but it complicates matters in some sense. I personally, I think the legitimacy is best to refer to the consent part of it. the procedure, the empirical part of it. And when one want to talk about the general, where things are in this more moral dimension, then one shouldn't use legitimacy, but talk about justice and ethics or fairness, and use those more political theory concepts and reserve legitimacy when we talk about this, how we generate or approve distributions or ethics. But that's just my, I think it's easy to organize the landscape, but you could do as you do, to take the legitimacy and work it, have two dimensions of it, one input and one output. That works also.
Yeah. Well, I'm thinking about the example you used of care for people with disabilities, to try to sort of bring them up. And I see some distinctions between that sort of a metaphor and healthcare, where people operate with very different capabilities, and the idea is to sort of bring them back up to their individual level so that they are not put at a disadvantage by circumstances around which they had no control or less control. And I wonder how that sort of a principle might apply in looking at adaptation, that there's an assumption that you correct a problem, but that you also get a contribution back from those people for whom the problem has been corrected. Am I making any sense?
Yeah.
As a way to sort of solve multiple problems, right? You're not just sort of making it right for people on a moral basis. You're also re-enabling their participation in society in a sense. So you get you get multiple dimensions that get pulled into that.
Yeah. Well, we haven't thought about it in this way. Only in the sense that if the idea is to help the disadvantaged to have really the same quality, organized society as it should be similar to everybody, even if you are blind or deaf or not. That is usually seen as a very, very costly to do it, and that usually we organize social security around a normality curve, and then we help the outliers as good as we can. Otherwise, it would be too. But sure, so to bring the ones who are really worst off has this very positive contribution to it also.
My name is Camilla Olsson. I work for an international consulting company called NERAS, working with the implementation of donor-funded development projects. And I want to go back to what you were touching upon before, the connection between development aid and climate change adaptation, because both when it comes to overseas development assistance and climate change mitigations, we have seen some difficulties in agreeing on global solutions. So my first question to you is, what do you think the chances are of successful coordinated approach to adaptation, as in case one? And the second, we see more and more climate change and climate change adaptation becoming a cross-cutting issue in development assistance. Do you think that is a way to go about it?
I'm sure most of you are much better than me on talking about whether climate change should be mainstream within different sectors and priorities, or whether it should be kept apart. But just our research in the UNFCCC negotiations and the way in which adaptation is treated there, I think it's interesting to see that you have adaptation both as a separate track since the Bali Action Plan, and then you have adaptation in what's usually called climate finance. And developing countries are very like to stress that the adaptation, they want a figure on the level of climate finance that would go to adaptation, while developed countries like to play that down and talk about climate finance. And I think that the developing countries are a little bit losing out when the funding questions are discussed as part of the climate finance track. And when we don't discuss numbers and money under adaptation, then we never talk about whether we have a sort of moral burden to pay for the ones who are affected. Adaptation just seen as part of one large climate finance discourse, and I actually think that is quite beneficial to us to view it like that. And the developing countries will be better off to sort of have a separate discussion on that you have a moral duty to pay for the harm that you have caused and things like that. and they gave away the funding questions and the money question from the adaptation track too quickly, I think. So if I would be them, I would try to draw it back. They are losing out when we talk about climate finance as an overall discourse, I think. The research that I've seen where people have actually tried to track down aid and climate finance and trying to get figures, it seems really, really difficult. Research probably come to very different estimates on the flows of money that goes around. So please enlighten me how much of the new research that is coming along so we can see. I think it's very tricky that we don't have those, we don't know or we don't agree on the flows of money that goes here and how to count them, how to calculate them, how to follow the money. My view from what I've learned from people who do climate finance is that they think that the money, if we would put all money through the sort of climate finance, we don't have the institutions that could deliver those kinds of money. I mean, the estimates by Benito Miller, I think that we would need hire 2,000 people working on this. So from a practical reason, I think the people in the development and finance agencies like to push it in more to the development kind of framework because there are the capacities and the people who can deal with those kinds of funds.
Hi, I'm Clarice Keller-Siebert. I work here at SCI with also Persson and Richard, working quite a bit on trying to track these financial flows. But my question is more about, we've recently started to question how to link the global governance of adaptation with what is essentially the local applied community, especially the autonomous aspect of adaptation happens very much at an applied level where among people who maybe aren't aware of the whole global architecture that we focus so much on and trying to link these communities. And I'm just curious whether and how you've thought about that sort of global and local dichotomy in assessing what is just and what is legitimate within your framework.
No, I don't think we looked at the NAPAs and sort of had a look at them, but the problem with the whole NAPA process seems to be that it has not received the legitimacy even on the ground, that NAPAs have been carried out, some of them were carried out by external consultants, just flying in and doing it. And in some cases they were carried out by the Ministry of Environment, so they didn't have then the kind of Minister of Finance, or they weren't on board for doing it. So pretty marginalized this kind of political procedure. I don't know actually whether the new NAPAs that are now coming along under the UNFCCC adaptation framework is there to actually increase the legitimacy and credibility of the NAPA way of doing things, or whether it's just sort of replicate things, or whether it will go down the same line as NAPAs have been doing. I don't see that NAPAs are now used really as steering the flows of adaptation money. I mean, they were set up for doing it, but now there's very loose writings in the Cancun agreements that where it should be taken into consideration and things like that. But I don't. So in that sense, well, the case is, to me, it doesn't look now that we are distributing the resources based on that inclusive participatory way or listen. But I'm not really an expert on that, and I think I won't have to look at maybe there are some successful NAPAs that have that legitimacy, that have been steering the decisions. But as far as when we looked at it, we didn't see it.
Can I do another question? I mean, I often think of this as more of a process orientation. But if you take the sort of the welfare system as a source of models for this, one of the considerations that comes up is solidarity, defined in terms of how of one group of people seeing themselves in somebody else's shoes. So, for example, in Sweden we have parental leave, we have this money for kids that goes out independent of people's means. It's the same amount to everybody. Part of the logic of that is that everybody gets the same experience, and it builds a sort of a general social support for maintaining that system. You see the same thing in the U.S. in Medicare, where independent of income, everybody's eligible for it. It's not a means-based system. So I wonder, in looking at legitimacy and the justice distributional questions, to what extent the idea of building this sense of seeing, putting yourself in other people's shoes comes into these kind of models, that something's included for the sake of this, the learning that goes on to understand, well, this could be me, it's not today. If that comes into the considerations.
Yeah, that is a very tough and tricky question. We solve it sort of in the papers that we're writing, but by stipulating, saying that, well, we believe there are positive cosmopolitan duties, that we have responsibility not to cause harm to people wherever they might live. So sort of just sort of taking that as a starting point. But you're right. Most of what we normally think about concepts of society or the people that we have obligations to, we are not used to think about that on any worldwide standard society. The whole sort of social theories and the idea of the social comes from very different kinds of entities. So, and a lot of those discussions in political theory about the principles that I worked through are often, as you say, that it's a country that has been the basis of those, and the solidarity, for them to work, they require that kind of solidarity. And we just say that, well, we think there are these positive cosmopolitan duties, but it's a much deeper philosophical work to be done there to really defend it. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, well, let's open up also for questions to both speakers. So, I mean, you can also direct speakers to me. Maybe you can come down here as well. There is no reason to try to rush any discussion because you think you're going to get early lunch, because there is no lunch there yet. So that's a good driver for, finding new questions. So, Oscar, you wanted to...
Yeah, this is a question of practical nature. Now what we see in front of us are these huge bags of money that should be distributed according to some principles. Have you done any work, or have you done any thinking around whether there are already sort of existing distribution mechanisms that are considered robust? I'm thinking trade, for example. I mean, would it be a more viable or robust way to create these benefits in these countries that you look at by reducing trade tariffs or something? I mean, by increasing flows into these countries that already exist and that are somewhat under some sort of control, and that also generate benefits on a wide scale of societal actors, rather than sending this big check to the government and then talk about principles for distributing money. I mean, have you done any thinking around that?
Not on trade. We did research on insurance and looked at how different kinds of insurance systems, starting both social insurance, how that works in welfare state, and how weather insurance works in vulnerable areas, and looked at the proposals for establishing insurance systems, and in which cases they are useful and not useful, and if they are useful overall. And our conclusion was that an overall idea, they are not that, neither practical or legitimate or just. But that would be maybe one, established systems of distributing resources. And yeah, good.
We actually have one project, recently started on that sort of topic, but it's more about generation of funds. So what we look at is the use of border adjustment taxes as one way of raising funding. The idea is that, okay, if manufacturing countries like China or Indonesia, what have you, import goods which don't include price carbon as part of the import price, we could actually put in a tariff to balance the cost of carbon on the border. But rather than kind of diverting that money to the domestic tax coffers, we might kind of put it to a fund which will then return the money to the country of origin of the imports. and that could, you know, basically generate a fund for both adaptation and mitigation in the country. We are more interested about really the, you know, scope and magnitude aspects of that kind of a solution. So it still doesn't, you know, address many of the, is this, you know, legitimate, you know, among the recipients, and then how would the money then be allocated, you know, to different types of activities in the countries that would kind of get it back.
Hi, my name is Alizan. I'm from Uppsala University. My question is perhaps quite specific and practical, and it's with regard to what extent could we expect the international community to pay? Previously working as a cost engineer in the disaster management area, a lot of the shortcomings are specifically to do with the fact that many of the hard measures are being funded, and many of the soft measures, such as capacity building and education, is not being funded. And my question is not specifically whether a project should be funded or not, but specifically one project, what do you fund? And is it realistic to expect the international community to fund all the education and capacity building initiatives on top of that?
Yeah, I think you are much more expert than this than I am. The idea with the things at NAPAS was that, I mean, the donors wouldn't decide which project to fund. That would be decided locally instead of a list of priorities. What we now see seems to be a lot that, like Norway or different deals, they go in and they want to finance particular projects that they think are high profile, or that they have some certain capacity, or that support export industry, and so, you know, cherry picking of the so that there will be a sort of plenty of different projects there, and then donors will go in and cherry pick and pick and choose a little bit. Or they're choosing some flagship projects, and one would be nice, and where they have already industry interest and all that. I mean, Åsa Persson has a really nice paper on that, on what she calls then the marketization of adaptation, or the commodification of adaptation, on this, this is going to sort of, capitalism will creep into these adaptation priorities, and will sort of, there will be an adaptation project markets, and with the best bidders, and so maybe this whole thing will just sort of get loose if we don't have a very tight process of adaptation priorities. And these are the priorities. And here, if you want to fund thing, start at the top. These are the projects that we want you to do. You can't pick and choose down the line whatever fits your priorities.
But isn't that then going back a bit to what Oscar was talking about? I mean, there is always a risk when you start to put up new funds or whatever, that it becomes like, I mean, it becomes projects basically. You apply and you try to get money. Why don't we focus much more on working on existing sort of international mechanisms, such as, for instance, trade, or directly linked to economic development, tax systems, etc., rather than building up new structures? I mean, obviously there is a risk there, as you say, building up these kind of structures, looking at the past also. You want to comment on that as well?
I would just want to compliment. I kind of very much agree with you, but this is also, you know, driven by domestic interests. So if you look at the NAPA processes and the kind of priorities that they generated, well, they are kind of about nation building big infrastructure and things like that. You wouldn't see necessarily the priorities of the kind that I thought would have been important. So, I mean, if you look at the consultation process that went on, for example, Tanzania, you know, those who participate in the NAPA process, you know, were primarily government employees, big NGO people, academics, and when they took the you know, process to regional consultation round, they basically wanted to hear about the regional authorities' view on that. And then the kind of package of priorities that emerges from that is not surprising, and it's kind of tying quite well with the donor side interest. So what you might have is, you know, the kind of biggest bang for the buck for both the recipient and donor, rather than you know, any more sophisticated reasoning what actually would be needed or what would most reduce the vulnerability. I think it's a good question, but what else could work? I guess there is enough of of a pluralist in me that I don't think that you should necessarily avoid having dedicated adaptation, finance structures in place, but I would also think that that is not the only thing that you would want to have, because trade or development assistance or other kind of routes do disperse the funding, and there is perhaps better chance in avoiding the worst of the outcome if there is enough fragmentation in the funding stream, so that nobody has monopoly over those ones.
So I have another question. I would like to elaborate on the notion that the gentleman in the green shirt made, because I think it has a strong implication on what you were talking about, justice and legitimacy. I'm currently working on flood protection and the story of physical measures. For example, a dam constitutes a huge, what they call sunk costs, because it's very intensive in resources. And the problem then kind of arises is that it kind of creates a shortage of resources on the other end, probably at the receiver's end. And I think that is a part, at least, of adaptive capacity and also of justice. So maybe the way how you actually prescribe the kind of measure is legitimate, and maybe actually the way you distribute it is just, but it kind of creates shortage on another end. So, yeah.
Any comments on that? Or you?
Yeah, that's a good point. The injustice of the response measures, so to say. Yeah, sure.
Hi, my name is Byung-Sik Yu. I'm here at SEI. Theoretically, if you have a legitimate government making a decision, but is maybe unjust or it could be interpreted as unjust, is there a way to kind of interpret it? Is there a way to intervene so that it becomes more just? I mean, did you have a process? Do you have an idea on that?
I don't think so. There is as it is now. We will see how the adaptation finance funding will work out. But I mean that is the core question. That if we really believe about legitimacy, and if we accept that those priorities that countries or communities are doing, if they then choose to distribute the resources in a way that we think is unjust, we should then still, if we defend their right to distribute them in that way. Although the question is how much weight do we want to put on the legitimacy here on the procedures, or if we want to have some checks there. It's a good question. I don't know. What do you think yourself?
That is my research question.
I mean, there are some really appalling cases, like with North Korea and nuclear. But I mean, there's plenty of cases in between, of course, and we know that a lot of those sort of participatory and localism procedures, as soon as you send a master student going there, or you field work, people come back saying that, well, it wasn't that inclusionary. There were a lot of power practices, and they were dominated by different ideologies, and so it's very difficult to say.
That's my question also. If you give this whole chunk of money, like Oscar said, to this one country, and you let them decide what they want to do with the adaptation because they're a legitimate government, you are going to experience a lot of money that's been used in a different use, but covered in a way that's going to be as an adaptation project or something like that. And how does the international society kind of deal with it? And I think it's a very difficult question. And I just wonder whether you had a good...
No, I think it's a question in the U.S. there's been a debate that Americans have said, well, we don't want to pay out money to corrupt bureaucracies and spending that, and it's our taxpayers' money, and we want to sort of decide what those money are going to get to. Sort of. However, I mean, if adaptation finance is seen as something that it's a compensation for the harm that you have caused, then you can't decide on how people should sort of compensate for that harm. So it's depends a little bit on a frame about the reasons why countries or individuals have an obligation to pay for adaptation causing the harm, or whether it's more because we are nice people and we are spending our taxpayers' money on it.
Yeah, this opens definitely a very complicated question about responsibility and so on. And that sounds like an excellent opportunity to actually find a good topic for a lunch discussion or debate or something like that, I would say. But it was really two extraordinary, excellent and interesting presentations that highlighted a lot of the real complexities of this issue, which is clearly a very difficult. I mean, obviously one thing is to try to get adaptation money in place in the first place. Then the hard work really starts. How should we then make sure that this hopefully quite substantial amount of resources are used in a fair and just, legitimate way? I mean, it's really very, very tricky, of course. So thank you very much to both speakers and also for a very active audience, I would say. So thank you also. So give them an applause. So for information now, food is going to be down in the lobby. You can also sit outside. You can find doors and sit outside. The weather is promising for that. Nothing bad. It doesn't have something good with it when it comes to climate change. We have more Southern European weather here in Sweden as well. Coffee and stuff is also available there, I think. Yes, after lunch. And yes, the secret code that we shouldn't distribute to people is 1415. Yes, you had a... Sorry, wait a second.
I'd just like to take the opportunity to mention that our Mistra-SWECIA annual reports once available on the page there. And if you're not already on the Mistra-SWECIA newslist, you can also add your name on the list.
So please be back at 1:30, please.